Chapter 3. From San Francisco to Ceylon. I-9, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, and I-25 set out after the American aircraft carrier Enterprise, and our I-15 came to the surface at once to join the chase. We worked up to 22 knots in pursuit, but never spotted anything. Some of the other submarines got into firing range of the Enterprise. Torpedoes were fired at her on 2 different days, one missing her by only 60 feet. This was a preview of what lay in store for other American carriers. Our submarines would do well in combat against them. I-170, under Takashi Sano, was lost during the pursuit. An Enterprise plane on patrol swooped down swiftly and bombed the submarine on the morning of Decathlon 10. Enough damage was done so that Sutta Sano dared not submerge his boat, and another Enterprise plane found him on the surface trying to make repairs in the afternoon. Sutta Sano, who'd been fortunate enough to survive the sinking of I-63 nearly 3 years before, went down with his ship and crew. To that point, the submarines in the 6th Fleet had nothing to show for their eastern strike except the American merchantman Cynthia Olson. Dr. Minoru Yokota, in I-26, sank this 240-ton vessel about 750 miles northwest of Seattle on the day war began. 4 days later, another of our submarines got SS Lahaina, 5,600 tons, between Oahu and San Francisco. I-9 was victor in that encounter. I-10 sank SS Don Nevale, 4473 tons, on Deck 9, on her way north to the U.S. west coast. On deck she had 14. The submarines that were chasing USS Enterprise were ordered to continue on to the west coast of the US. There the 7 of us, plus I-10 and I-26, were assigned patrol stations in order to attack enemy shipping. It was our job to cut off any supplies and reinforcements destined for Pearl Harbor, where enemy losses had been great. I-15 took station west of the Farallon Islands, off San Francisco. On December 17th, through my binoculars, I could see the glow cast upon the sky by the lights of San Francisco, and thought to myself, they certainly don't act like there is a war going on, allowing such illumination to silhouette their shipping along the coast. Captain Hiroshi Imazato, who commanded the 1st Division of Subron 1, was on the bridge also, chatting with Dr. Ishikawa. "I've never been to America," he said jokingly. "If we weren't at war, this would be an excellent chance to pass in through the Golden Gate and visit that famous city of San Francisco." Our I-15 was one of 11 boats in the Pearl Harbor force that carried an airplane, so I interrupted the conversation of my 2 seniors. "Sir," I said to Captain Imazato, "if you wish, we could launch our aircraft. That would give you an excellent chance to do some sightseeing." They both laughed and joked about it for quite a while, which shows how high our spirits were in those early days. There were no light reflections in the sky the following night. Somehow the Americans had learned of our presence. We heard a number of patrol boats, and our radio men listened in on many plain language uncoded message exchanges. This made it easy for us to dodge the hunters. We were on station for 8 days, but made neither a sighting nor an attack during that time. Other submarines fared better. Dr. Kozo Nishino's I-77 claimed 2 cargo ship sinkings. Dr. Kanji Matsumura's I-27 also claimed a pair. Dr. Genichi Shibata's I-23 attacked a small patrol boat in full view of spectators on shore at Monterey, California. Dr. Meiji Tagami's I-25 chased a large merchantman right into the Columbia River, Oregon, where it ran aground. Besides these reported kills, our submarines made hits on other ships which managed to limp away. One of our subs, off Long Beach, California, reported many people sunning beneath colourful beach umbrellas, as though they'd never heard of a war. This same submarine reported that its crewmen on deck could read print at night by the lights of automobile headlights on the shore. Such things made Japanese Navy men contemptuous of Americans at the war's start. A few days after we got on station, I-15 and other submarines received a wireless from Vice Admiral Shimizu. We were to depart our patrol areas on Christmas Day and return to Kwajalein, where he had his headquarters. But first he had a special present he wanted delivered to America, all the rounds of 4.7 ammunition we could pour out of our deck guns. All 9 submarines were to shell the mainland, I-15's target being San Francisco. On December 24th, just hours before I-15 was to commence its bombardment, this order was countermanded by one from Tokyo, sent by Adam Osami Nagano. I never learned the reason why. So it was bows west for I-15 next day, without having hurt the enemy at all. Nor had much been accomplished by our subs that remained in the Pearl Harbor area. On December 17th and 18th, they sank 2 merchantmen, SS Prusa and SS Manini, I-172, getting the first and I-175 the second. But the great bag of warships envisioned by Admiral Shimizu never materialized. The submarines that launched midgets never recovered any of them, and had to be content with shelling Maui, Hawaii, and Johnson Island. Chief accomplishment in Hawaiian waters was brought off by I-7. At dawn on the 16th, she launched her Type 96 float plane and sent it over Pearl Harbor for reconnaissance. What the pilot and his observer saw confirmed the reports by Sea Dr. Fuchida's flyers 9 days earlier. 5 American battleships, including USS Utah, were sunk, and many ships in the harbor had been damaged, besides the airplanes destroyed. The Pacific battle fleet of the US was no more, at least for a good long while. The reconnaissance aircraft landed alongside I-7 and its crew swam to the submarine, which dived at once, abandoning the aircraft. Information was more important, especially since it confirmed a great victory. Later, we were amused that American authorities held back the truth about the damage inflicted at Pearl Harbor for a very long time. It was not a secret in Japan. We had full details, including pictures, right from the start. Unusual about I-7's great coup was the way her aircraft was launched. She was the first submarine of our Navy designed completely by our own people. Her aircraft catapult was mounted aft of her conning tower, and her plane launched over her stern. Whenever there was not enough wind to give the aircraft flying speed, I-7 had to head into the wind to make enough relative wind for the plane to take off. But she had to run in reverse to do this. So it was on December 16th, 1941, 9 days after an all-out attack by our first air fleet, that the defences of Pearl Harbor, supposedly thorough alert by now, were penetrated again, this time by a slow-flying biplane after it. Was launched from a backward-churning submarine. Wake Island was attacked and captured while I-15 was off San Francisco. Submarines played no role in this fighting, except to act as sentries for ships that shelled Wake and unloaded assault troops there. An American relief force, centered on the carrier Saratoga, approached the island from the east, but was summoned back when only a day's cruising from strike position. The official U.S. naval history of the war, which is replete with errors, criticizes the admiral responsible for this decision, but he may have made a wise one. The American anti-submarine technique at that time was very poor, though it would be refined to a great art later. Our RO-class submarines, under Rear Adm. Shinzo Onishi, might have had an unpleasant surprise waiting for Saratoga and company. Twice in the war, our submarines would put Saratoga out of action for long periods, with their torpedoes. Those early days of the war might have seen them sink her had she come much closer to Wake Island. 2 submarines scouting and covering for the force taking Wake Island collided in close manoeuvres on Decknosselm 17. RO-66 hit RO-62, commanded by Lieutenant Hideyuki Kurokawa, not far from Wake, but most of the latter's crew were saved before the submarine went down, and 14 days later, RO-60, arriving at Kwajalein in very bad weather, ran aground with such force that she split her hull and had to be abandoned. All hands were saved, through, and lived to fight again. At the close of 1941, the Sixth Fleet had lost 3 submarines, I-170, RO-60, and RO-66. These losses didn't seem damaging, At the time, we had 29 additions to the 6th Fleet under construction. RO-class submarines operated against Howland and Baker Islands and in the Solomons area. In the Western Ocean areas, our Army and Navy were meeting with success after success. They had taken Hong Kong on Decker 25, and our troops were ashore in the Philippines and doing well. Roads on the Malay Peninsula were few and bad, but a bicycle with a man on it needs only about a foot-wide path. Our infantry carried bicycles that could be disassembled and folded into a small package, as occupation troops who purchased them after the war found out. These carried Japan's land forces across the swampy, marshy areas Great Britain had counted upon to provide a barrier against any enemy marching on the Singapore bastion by land. Meanwhile, at sea, Japanese submarines played a singular role in an event that had battleship admirals rubbing their eyes in disbelief when they read of it. The 30 submarines sent eastward and the 9 in the mandated islands left 18 available for use in the southern areas, which were marked for Japan's main advance. All 4 boats in Subron 6 were mine-laying types, old and slow, and definitely not considered choice duty by submariners. They were I-121, I-122, I-123, and I-124, under Rear Adm. Chimaki Kono. They laid mines off Singapore just as the war began, and claimed the sinking of 1 merchantman in that area. Then they moved off to the Philippines in support of our troops landing there. The other 14 submarines in the south included 8 of Subron 4, under Rear Adm. Etuzo Yoshitomi, and 6 of Subron 5, under Rear Adm. Tadashige Daigo. All had the same triple mission: protect Japanese army troops wherever landed, patrol waters off the Malay Peninsula, and attack enemy ships as they appeared. 2 of these submarines, in Subron 5, hurried the end of HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales, the striking force sent to the Far East by Churchill, as part of an anti-Japanese agreement made between the US and Great Britain many months before the war started. These battleships were to join up with American and Dutch forces and crush any southward Japanese naval movement. The striking force was weaker than had originally been intended. HMS Indomitable, a British aircraft carrier, was to have been part of it, but she ran aground at Kingston, Jamaica, on November 3 and had to be put into dry dock. So Rear ADM. Tom Phillips of the Royal Navy had only 2 capital ships and no naval air power when he reached the Far East. He was heading for Singapore when the US aircraft carrier arrived at Cape Town, South Africa, as escort to 20,000 British troops. The Ranger, 2 cruisers and 8 destroyers had accompanied 6 transports from Halifax, leaving there nearly a month before war began. America, supposedly at peace, provided safe conduct for troops of a nation at war, troops who could only be employed in war against Japan. Phillips took his 2 battleships into Singapore, left them there, and flew at once to Manila for conferences with ADM. Thomas Hart, commander of the US Asiatic Fleet. Phillips was very worried about having no screening force except for a few escorts for his capital ships. But as he was leaving Manila, Hart told him that 4 American destroyers were refuelling at Balikpapan, Borneo. They were supposed to top off their tanks and head for Batavia, Java, for a period of rest and recreation, but had been putting off their departure under various pretexts. When they did leave, Hart told Phillips, they would secretly steam north to join Prince of Wales and Repulse. Under the ruse of joint manoeuvres, a strongly escorted striking force would thus be formed, ready to challenge any Japanese naval movement southward. The scheme of the 2 flag officers did not work out. Phillips was dead, and his 2 great ships sunk before the American destroyers reached Singapore. When Tom Thumb, as British sailors called him because of his diminutive stature, arrived back at Singapore, he learned that a British plane had sighted a large Japanese convoy steaming west across the Gulf of Siam, north of Singapore, heading for Thailand. This was our invasion force, which had rounded the southern tip of Indochina. Phillips knew he'd have very little air cover to defend him from the planes we had stationed around Saigon, but he dared not wait. He couldn't allow an invasion landing to be successful. He slipped out of Singapore, ran east for a while in the hope of confusing our navy, then headed north. He hoped to catch our invasion fleet while it still stood off the beaches on the east coast of the peninsula, landing troops. Philip's feint to the east did him little good. Within 24 hours of sailing, he was sighted by I-156, Sea Doctor Hakue Harada. At about 3 p.m. on December 9, the two battleships appeared in Harada's periscope. He surfaced after they passed and radioed their position to our Indochina land-based planes. Somewhere in the coding, transmission, decoding and transcribing, a mistake was made. The positions the air squadrons got was 0700N, 105V00E. This almost caused our search planes to attack our covering force, which was trailing our own convoy, ready to attack anything that challenged it. But another submarine captain, Lieutenant Katsuo Ohashi, in I-756, sighted the two battleships about 13 hours later. By then, Phillips had given up hope of catching the convoy, which had unloaded its troops and departed. He was steaming south when Ohashi saw him, at too high a speed for a torpedo attack to be made. When this second sighting was reported, pilots took off at first light. 10 hours after Ohashi's sighting, the great behemoths were at the bottom of the sea. Our Navy planes had flown twice the distance any other country thought bombers could to sink them. American pilots would not make a strike as long-reaching as this for several years. Our training had paid off with Japan's winning control of all the waters around Malaya and the Philippines, and battleships were finished as the backbone of modern fleets, though Great Britain and America built numbers of them during the war, and Japan completed Yamato's sister ship, Musashi. No battleship would accomplish anything of significance during the Pacific Naval War. Submarines and aircraft would write the story. I-15 arrived at Kwajalein on Jan. 15 from the American coast. Until then, our contribution to the war effort had been exactly 0. Our crew was cheerful, though. In spite of a very rough first Pacific crossing that had wrecked some submarine-borne aircraft, the success of 1st Air Fleet's smash at Pearl Harbor buoyed us up during weeks that passed without any major accomplishments by 6th Fleet submarines. At a conference held on board Katori the day we arrived at Kwajalein, the total result of our efforts was summed up. My squadron was credited with 11 ships sunk, 2 damaged. Subron 2 was credited with 4 sunk, 1 damaged. This last was the carrier Saratoga, into which I-6 had put a torpedo on Jan. 10, about 500 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. This ship, much feared because our aircraft had not found her present at Pearl Harbor on Deck 7, was put out of action for 5 months. She missed the Battle of Midway. Subron 3 was credited with 2 ships sunk against the loss of I-170. The total of 17 sinkings and 3 ships damaged, compared with German successes in the Atlantic, was not considered impressive. Vice Adem. Shimizu was much dismayed, and others who were with him at the conference expressed the same disappointment. Yet, some who were present concentrated on discussing the poor anti-submarine tactics of the American Navy and ridiculing poor American marksmanship. The conference decided that Japanese submarines should in the future be used mainly for the destruction of enemy supply ships. The previous strategy of sending us against warships was to be discarded. We would pay dearly for the change. Crew rest was the order of the day for all submarines upon first arriving at Kwajalein. My check of I-15 turned up a surprising fact. In 8 weeks of cruising, we'd not had a single case of illness, injury, or a maintenance problem of more than minor importance. Though fresh water must be conserved on submarines, my records showed that I'd been able to allow our men showers every 3 days and washing of underwear every 5. The war would later change this, but at the moment morale was high. "Except for no drinking or recreation," said one crew member. "I prefer wartime cruising to peacetime." Everyone, thinking back on the long, difficult fleet exercises and the days-on-end weariness, had to agree with him. Hard training had cost us 3 submarines since 1939, and there had been many cases of collision. and near collisions as Sixth Fleet boats slipped beneath escort screens during manoeuvres to attack our capital ships. Surface ships had also suffered collisions during the night practice drills the Imperial Navy concentrated on so much. Our aircraft losses were greater in peacetime than any other nation's due to intensive training that often saw pilots in the air as long as 12 hours per day. Now, with the war at last started, life seemed far less difficult than in those days. Our lookouts were as alert as ever, for example, but less tense. They felt they knew their jobs and could do them well. A ship spotted on the horizon now would not have a fleet umpire on board it, but rather a ready gun crew, and an airplane sighted would no longer be a friendly one from Iwakuni or Atsugi, but one whose crew wanted to sink us. Yasukuni Mam, a former liner making European runs, had been converted to a submarine tender. She was in company with Katori at Kwajalein, and crews of all submarines were treated to hot baths on board her. Pure hot water and soap can provide one of a man's most thrilling experiences, especially when he has been confined within a stuffy steel tube with 100 other sweaty, dirty, smelly human beings. Showers can never get a man as clean as our old-fashioned Japanese bath. We scrubbed ourselves immaculate first, using small buckets and soap, then rinsed ourselves off with hot water, using the same buckets. After that, we lowered ourselves into a depot furo with a long, drawn-out ah of pure contentment. While I lay there, letting the heat soak to the marrow of my bones, I thought of my wife and infant son in Japan. My firstborn son, Shuichi, came into the world on July 28, 1941, while I-75 was still on manoeuvres in the mandated islands, preparing for the day when we might have to defend those islands against an enemy. On arrival at Yokosuka, I had no chance to visit my family. My duties as executive officer were too many and important to allow me time away from the ship. It was a 30-hour train ride via the fastest express to Kagoshima, where they were. I had to settle for an evening of sake celebration at the Officers' Club with Minoru Yonehara, Toshisada Tokutomi and Seihachi Toyomasu, fellow submariners and lieutenants who had been my classmates at Etajima. Later, when I-15 went to Kure for a while, I strongly urged Hisako to come and visit me, although our son was only weeks old. We Oritas had 3 quick passing days in a Kure hotel together, and now I had only pictures of my wife and son, to remind me of home. It was bitter, just as it would be many other times during the war. To think as I lay in that tub that I had let nearly 6 years pass for Hisako and myself between our omiai, first confrontation, and our marriage in 1939. Those extra half-dozen years would have given me hundreds more sweet memories to carry to war with me. The baths were followed by a motion picture and a dinner consisting of fresh foods. Both were pure delights to men who'd had only one another to look at and who had been eating out of tins since before taking station off Pearl Harbor. I have read that on board American submarines during the war the food was truly delicious, and that great pains were taken in selecting cooks as well as menus to make it so. In our submarines we had better than average food, but nothing like what the Americans had. During the 3rd year of the war, great emphasis was placed by 6th Fleet Headquarters on our men getting special food. Before that, men sometimes suffered mild cases of beriberi on long cruises, in spite of vitamin injections. After a few days of rest, I started I-15's men on the task of readying our boat for her next sortie. The hull, weapons and engines received a thorough going over. This is much harder to do at a mid-ocean atoll than at a home shipyard, where the skills and tools of civilian workers can be employed. No wonder Litsida Yahachi Tanabe, after he had sunk the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown at Midway and was awarded a new submarine to command, asked especially for crewmen who had plenty of civilian mechanical experience to be assigned to his boat. He got them, and as a result survived in I-176, what should have been certain death from the guns of American ships. I'll tell of that later. Repair and maintenance, including a new coat of black paint for I-15's hull, kept the crew busy when they were not on air raid watch. We expected enemy aircraft carriers to make some kind of thrust before long. When they came, we wanted to be ready. Tokyo was very worried about Lexington, Yorktown, Saratoga, and Enterprise. The submarine who sank one of them would receive great honours. Before that happened, Yanchatan 17 arrived with it a flood of orders from Tokyo that caused a general shuffling of 6th Fleet officers. Many new submarines were scheduled for completion in 1942. All would need commanding officers. I was one of those selected to take the commanding officers course at submarine school. This was a double thrill for me. It meant I would soon be commanding my own boat, something I'd been hoping for since my days as a lower-classman at the Naval Academy. It also meant I would have some time with my family. Perhaps Shuichi would get to know his father this time, and I would have a chance to enjoy reading, walking, and seeing motion pictures with Hisako, 3 pastimes we both enjoyed very much. I also looked forward to my wife's fine meals. My relief arrived at Kwajalein on Jan. 21.1 spent 2 days turning over my post to him, then boarded I-6 on Jan. 24 to leave for Japan. The return trip was pleasant because her crew was so elated over their successful attack on the carrier Saratoga. That one blow had seriously weakened any move the Americans might make against our forces for a while. I also spent a lot of time conferring with I-6's officers about our submarine operations to that date. We agreed that trying to approach enemy ports, the pre-war strategy, was practically hopeless with the enemy aroused and alert. The best thing to do was to attack merchantmen, without whose support warships in the Pacific could not operate for long. Mentioned frequently was the success Germany had been enjoying with these tactics for more than 2 years. As soon as I got ashore in Yokosuka, I sent a hasty message to Hisako, asking her to join me at Kure with our baby. Then 16 of us headed south to submarine school. Before our classes started, we discussed over and over again what had been talked about at Kwajalein. Finally, we drafted our opinions as seconds in command into one statement and requested that the course we were going to study should give special attention to the following set of opinions. 1. Our torpedoes are propelled by oxygen. They are very fast and give off no wake, but at shallow depth setting, especially at 6 or 7 feet, they often porpoise. The enemy can see them and dodge, shifting at once to the counterattack. Very dangerous to us. Also, our torpedoes have impact-type exploders, requiring a direct hit to detonate them. Torpedoes might be more effective if they had less speed, more shallow water stability, and a magnetic-type exploder that would make them detonate beneath a ship if they passed under it. 2. Torpedoes should be expended more liberally. At present, the tendency is to fire only 1 or 2 if the target is a destroyer or cargo ship, and to fire a full salvo only at a cruiser or larger vessel. This is foolish economy. It increases the enemy's chances of getting away. Also, though intelligence has provided us much information about enemy warships, we possess very little about enemy merchant ships. This should be increased. 3. Small ships are a submarine's worst enemy, being hard to hit and hardest to evade. When we reach the attack practice portion of the course, small ships of high speed should be used for targets, also merchant ships when available. From our practice, we can develop proper tactics for use against these 2 types. I-6 arrived at Yokosuka on February 1, the same day an American task force under Rear Adm. William Halsey attacked the Marshall Islands. Fortunately for our submarines, Halsey's planes hit another part of Kwajalein Atoll before hitting our base. That gave plenty of time for all submarines to pull the plug and drop to the lagoon's bottom. And, fortunately for Halsey, his carriers were a good distance from Kwajalein when his planes were launched. Otherwise, they might have suffered the same fate as Saratoga, or worse, because Halsey remained in one area for quite a long time. No submarines were damaged at Kwajalein, but our surface ships and the shops on shore suffered some. Admiral Shimizu was wounded, and eventually had to be relieved of command. Before that, he ordered all submarines present to find the enemy task force and sink it. They headed out on the surface at top speed, but none could catch up with Halsey's force. So most put about and returned to Kwajalein. I-9 and I-23 went to the Hawaii area. I-17 went on to the west coast of the US. I-25 came back, and shortly thereafter set out for the South Seas. Her aircraft pilot, Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, made flights over several enemy strongpoints and brought back information that helped keep our high command informed of enemy warships' locations. Submarines had not been idle since the first of the year. I-24 had been patrolling off Hawaii. Our mine-laying squadron was in place off northern Australia. The RO types screened and scouted for aircraft carriers that smashed at Rabaul on the island of New Britain and for our ships that landed men there to take Rabaul easily on Jan. 23. The Rabaul capture put the total of successful Japanese amphibious operations since Deccan 7 past the 20 mark. I-18 and I-24 tried to shell Midway Island but had to dive when enemy gunners returned fire. Along the Malay Barrier, which the enemy was trying desperately to hold as the last barricade against any Japanese advance on Australia, our 6th Fleet boats were helping surface ships and aircraft against the enemy. I-162, I-164, I-165, and I-166 all reported sinking ships off Sumatra, Java, Burma, Ceylon, and India. We lost 3 more submarines during January. Lieutenant Secretary Shun Hasegawa and his crew in I-160 fell victim to the British destroyer Jupiter in the Sunda Strait on Jan 17 while attacking enemy shipping heading to and from Singapore. I-173, the boat of Sea Data Akira Isobe, was sunk in mid-Pacific 10 days later. Her loss confirmed the complaints submarine captains had been making about Tokyo requiring too many wireless reports. I-173 was geographically located, and her intentions roughly determined because of this. She had been patrolling off Hawaii and was on her way to Yokosuka. Powerful American radio direction finders plotted the sites of her transmissions by triangulation, and her course and speed were roughly calculated while she was responding to numerous requests for information. The American submarine Gudgeon was able to lie along her proposed path and sink I-173 north of Midway. The 3rd submarine lost in January was I-124, a mine-laying type, like the American submarines Nautilus and Argonaut of that era. I-124 was off Singapore when the war began, secretly laying mines that we believe sank several merchant ships later. Then she moved to the Philippines, where she reported sinking 1 ship before sailing south to stand watch off northern Australia. Our land and sea forces were rolling very rapidly through the southern area, so much sought after for its raw materials and other resources. Adam Yamamoto very much wanted information about any proposed enemy movements to block our attacks on Rabaul and New Guinea. The carriers Keiga, Akagi, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had enough air strength to handle any opposition to the invasions, but the Nagumo force needed to know of any surface opposition headed its way. I-124 must have ventured too close to the enemy port of Darwin, Australia. Perhaps Captain K.U. Endo, her division commander who was on board, had ordered her taken that far in. She was detected by the US destroyer Edsall just outside Darwin, while the American destroyer was escorting a convoy into port. Edsall radioed a position report but stayed with her charges until they were safely inside the anchorage. Then she put about to join 3 Australian corvettes that had answered her call. They were dropping depth charges when the American destroyer returned to the scene. She used her sound equipment to assist them, then made a depth charge attack herself. Lieutenant Dr. Koichi Kishigami, his crew and his division commander went down with their ship. This was an unusual sinking, in that it was later fully confirmed by Allied divers, who went down and actually stood on I-124's hull. That made 6 submarines lost in a little more than 6 weeks. Fate allowed HMS Jupiter and USS Edsall no more chances at us. Both went to the bottom before the middle of March, along with nearly all the naval strength that the Allies sent into the Malay Barrier area. Meanwhile, I-17 was getting ready to make coastal residents of America scream, "Where is our Navy?" In Tokyo, orders were being passed from the red brick building of our Navy Ministry to Combined Fleet for a special operation. These orders, relayed to 6th Fleet Headquarters and to land-based naval aircraft commands, would give Americans at Pearl Harbor something new to think and worry about. It would be called the K Operation. Chapter 4. Shells on Santa Barbara. More bombs on Pearl Harbor. C. Dr. Kozo Nishino had command of I-17 at the time, Vice ADM. Shimizu ordered all submarines at Kwajalein to chase and sink the American task force. Nishino pursued almost as far as Oahu, then continued to the U.S. West Coast, where his gun crew shelled an oil storage field at Elwood City, near Santa Barbara, California. The diary of Seaman Genji Hara, radio operator serving with Nishino, has survived. Here are some excerpts from it. February 21. I-17 is once more operating off the coast of America, but this time we are alone. Our movements have been slow, and the sea ripples softly along the sides of our ship. The vast spread of the Pacific seems like a watery waste to me. Wireless reception from the 6th Fleet Communications Tower on Kwajalein was very good today, but I could not hear much of what I-23 was sending. She is in the Hawaiian area and must be having trouble with her transmission equipment. Around midnight I heard a lookout reporting a lighthouse off to port, but by 0100 it was discovered to be a light from an enemy small craft. It could have been a fishing boat, but the captain thought it might be a patrol boat. We increased speed and rapidly moved away from it. After getting off watch I slept a while, but was awakened at 200 with the order, "Stand by to submerge." The voice on the loudspeaker circuit said, "There may be an enemy patrol boat following us. All hands rig for depth charge attack." Then I-17 dipped silently beneath the surface, where we cut off all unnecessary machinery. The only noise I could hear came from the hum of our sound detection equipment. Nothing happened. After a while, we surfaced. I went back to the radio room and found that some messages that had arrived earlier had been decoded. They listed the places that I-17, together with other submarines, were to bombard and others, like San Diego, we were to avoid. I felt a thrill, as though we would really carry out the task this time and not have it cancelled, as it had been in December. February 24. After surfacing, Captain Nishino told the crew of his plans. "We are now entering Santa Barbara Strait," he said. "We will lie submerged tomorrow, doing reconnaissance with our periscope. Then, tomorrow night, we will surface after dark and bombard the Elwood oil field, inside the strait." "We are really going to do it this time," I told myself. As a substitute gunner in case a gun crew member was injured or killed, I had to check over our deck weapon. About 30 knots of wind was blowing over the deck while we did it, and there were plenty of white caps on the waves. There was a dull half-moon with a hazy halo about it. I looked up into the sky and located Great Bear and the Northern Star. Then I tried to estimate the direction of Japan from where I stood. In that moment I hoped that if I died, the people back home would know that I-17 had reached out 4,000 miles to strike at America for them. I felt very warm and full of sentiment at that moment. February 25. Today I was fascinated by sounds Seaman Nagashima was picking up on our sound equipment. "Iruka!" he called out suddenly, and those of us in the room listened to the bleating noises similar to the crying Iruka fish off Kyushu near home. Then we settled down into silence, everyone probably thinking the same thing as I. We will bombard. The enemy will return our fire. We will run away to escape. They will come after us. Lunch was canned inari sushi, vinegared rice wrapped in thin fried bean curd. All hands waited anxiously for the order to battle surface. Someone passing my station while coming down from the conning tower said, "Land is in sight." Then I-17 changed course and, at a slow pace, began navigating blindly through Santa Barbara Strait, not even showing its periscope for fear of making a telltale spray. I tried to calm down by reading a book, but couldn't. I had finally decided to try to eat something, to distract my mind when the word was passed, "All hands to battle stations." It was then about 5:30 p.m. 10 minutes later, Captain Nishino ordered battle surface, "Man the deck gun." The gun captain had assembled his crew near the hatch earlier. They went on deck. Captain Nishino kept calling out, asking the distance to land and the submarine's depth, giving instructions about the targets. He ordered that shells be fired only at oil tanks. Only the gunners were on deck. The rest of us, in our windowless barracks, could only listen and imagine what it was like above from the sounds and shocks that came through the hull. 1, 2, 3. We could imagine the gunners loading each of those rounds, the trainer and the pointer trying to sight on the target. We had counted up to 17 when the shooting suddenly stopped. Petty Officer Homer and I had the radio watch. We spun our receiver dials, trying to find some indication of American reaction. There was none. We heard no alarm or call for help. The California radio station programs continued as leisurely as before. Gunners dropped through the hatch and I-17 began picking up speed. 2 of the crew, Onodera and Nagata, came into the radio room. "What did we hit?" I asked them. "I don't know," Onodera said. "I only saw flashes. I had no time to confirm anything." Nagara said it was beautiful and that he could see automobile headlights. The navigator came into the radio room then. "We started shelling right after sunset," he said. There was no reply until we started speeding away. Some enemy planes dropped flares, but they were far from our position. The reaction set in then. "We are the first to bombard America," everyone began telling one another. "Even if we didn't hit a thing, they know I-17 has been here." All of us felt like heroes. It was a feeling I-17's crew had earned. Newspapers in California carried panic headlines and stories about the shelling by a Jap U-boat. Demands were made on the American government to protect the coast with its navy. For 17 rounds of ammunition, Nishino's men cost the U.S. Navy many millions of dollars in time, money, ships, and men, providing escort. 3 years would pass before West Coast waters were considered safe from our attacks. Less than 2 weeks after I-17's bold feat of shelling the American coastline, a feat comparable to that of the great John Paul Jones's raiding of the English coastline generations before, our 6th Fleet submarines helped embarrass the U.S. Navy again. This action, titled K-Operation, was planned in Tokyo during January 1942, then passed to Admiral Yamamoto for execution. The Japanese Navy would attack Pearl Harbor again. 2 giant 4-engined flying boats were to be used. These massive patrol planes could fly nearly across the Pacific Ocean non-stop, each bearing 1 ton of bombs. Not very much explosives, but if they could be dropped on the American base, it would shake the morale of the Americans. Or so it was thought. Some writers have said that a story in the Saturday Evening Post before the war inspired the K-Operation. I don't know if this is true, but it was a most imaginative idea that required much planning and careful execution. 7 of our 6th Fleet's submarines were to take part, providing support for these 2 bombers. The bombers would fly from Japan to Woche, in the Marshalls, where submarine crewmen were training in the technique of refueling aircraft from their boats. On a designated day, the planes would take off from the lagoon at Woche and fly to French frigate shoals, over 1,600 miles away in the northwest portion of the Hawaiian Islands chain. One of our submarines, I-9, would take station halfway along this route and provide a radio beacon to guide the bombers on their way. French Frigate Shoals is a small outcropping, just barely rising above the sea, about 500 miles northwest of Oahu. It is far enough away from Pearl Harbor that the enemy neglected it, knowing it was too small for us to base aircraft there or to be used as an airbase by them. It did have a navigable lagoon, though, and that's all that the K operation needed. My old boat, I-15, together with I-19 and I-26, had their aircraft removed, and the hangar space was used for storing a massive amount of aviation gasoline. These 3 boats were to head for French frigate shoals and wait for the 2 flying boats. The amphibians would be refueled to capacity and take off again, swinging southeast to Pearl Harbor. A long dock on the shore opposite the south side of Ford Island was to be the aiming point for the plane's bombs. Their arrival over Pearl Harbor was timed for after midnight, as the enemy's capability for night fighting was considered very poor. The bombers would make one pass, dropping their bombs, and then head back for Watje, non-stop. A 5th submarine, I-25, would be standing by south of Pearl Harbor for air-sea rescue, a use to which our subs were put long before the Americans thought of it. Another pair of submarines were to be deployed as radio beacons along the southern route home. Sea Dr. Akiosbi Fuji's I-9 and Sea Dr. Junichi Shibata's I-23 were given their K operation instructions by wireless on February 14, so they would have time to take stations by March. L. Fuji acknowledged, and carried out his assignment. Shibata also acknowledged, on February 14, but nothing was heard from him after that. I assume that I-23 was lost operationally sometime later. Submarine crewmen get tired and bored, and weary and sleepy. The peak efficiency they reach after months of training falls off during weeks of hard patrolling, sometimes only just long enough for a vital valve to be left open or the wrong control wheel turned. It happened to American submarines during the war, and it happened to ours. Boats disappeared without a trace, although no combat log of either Japan or America reported any attack on them. The flying boats arrived in the Marshalls in mid-February. They made practice refuelings and short flights. I-19's aircraft made a reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on Feb. 23, the second such flight over the island fortress since Dexter 7, 1941. Then I-19 made for French frigate shoals. On March 3, 1942, the 2 planes took off on their historic flight at about 3:30 a.m. They landed at French frigate shoals 13 hours later. I-15 and I-19 were in the lagoon, waiting. Their crews gave the 2 aircraft a great drink of fuel, and the amphibians were away again 3 hours after that, arriving over Oahu about 1 a.m. They were detected by radar, just as the planes originally attacking Pearl Harbor on Dexter 7 had been, but our planes once more got above the island without opposition. Up to that point, all had gone off without a hitch. Then the weather took a hand, something that might not have happened had Kwajalein heard from I-23, which was supposed to be providing weather reports. Our pilots found a low overcast obscuring their target. Flying blind, each pilot tried to get his bearings from a landmark and calculate where the long dock, called 1010 by the US Navy, was. This didn't work, so the pair dropped their bombs anyway, just to let the enemy know that Japanese planes had been overhid again. Both arrived safely home after a flight that covered 4,000 miles and took 24 hours to complete. One load of bombs fell harmlessly into the sea. The other landed far from Pearl Harbor, to the east of downtown Honolulu. It caused consternation among the public, who blamed the American military for carelessness. The American military put the blame on one another, with Army pilots accusing Navy pilots of jettisoning bombs without watching where they went, and vice versa. It was not until bomb fragments were found and identified that the truth came out. Our K operation has been criticized by writers as having no effect on the war. I think of it as indicating the kind of spirit that prevailed among Japanese leaders at the time. Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and Java were in our hands, as were Wake, Guam, and portions of the Philippines. Our ships and planes were scoring one victory after another. Our high command felt very confident and willing to try anything that would keep the enemy off balance and worried. I was starting the commanding officer's submarine course at Kure and enjoying the only home life I would know for a long time when the Java Sea battle was fought. A mixed force of British, Dutch, American and Australian ships under the Netherlands, Admiral Karel Doorman, tried to stop our invasion convoy headed for Java. Our covering force nearly wiped out the Allied force, mainly through the use of the above-water counterpart of the torpedo carried in our submarines. Named the Model 93, it had been first tested in 1933 and was kept completely secret from all foreigners. It would remain secret until 1945, although I understand that Americans obtained one during the middle of the war without realizing its speed and power. March and April were fairly good months for the Japanese submarine fleet. Our boats did well in the Indian Ocean and Java Sea, as well as on the east and west coasts of Australia. On March 16th, the wounded and ailing Shimizu was relieved as Commander 6th Fleet by Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu. In April, it was declared formal policy to have our submarines operate chiefly against enemy merchantmen instead of against warships. This was pleasing news to us at submarine school. We thought the anti-merchant effort a much better use of submarines and kept pointing to Germany as an example. Our new plan to throw a blockade around Allied holdings in the Pacific Indian Ocean areas might seem overly ambitious, and one look at a chart of that part of the world might at first prove dismaying. But a closer look would show the enemy held only a few worthwhile ports in early 1942, mostly in Australia and India. Covering the Cape of Good Hope and the exits from the Suez Canal sufficiently should cut the flow of goods from the west. And we were to have the help of some German submarines in doing that. American supplies could land at only a few places in New Zealand, New Caledonia and Australia when coming from the east. With Truk and Rabaul as bases, our submarines could easily be deployed across shipping routes. Besides our submarine effort, plans were being made to move into bases in the southeastern Solomons. From there, sea- and land-based aircraft could keep an eye on the southern seas, assisting us. For these purposes, submarines began returning to Japan for refit and overhaul. I-25 got back to Yokosuka after having sent Warrant Officer Fujita's plane over a number of enemy anchorages. Subrons 4, 5 and 6 were ordered back from southwestern waters, and some of its boats were earmarked for withdrawal from active combat service. They were to be assigned as training boats in the inland sea for men who would man the new submarines to be commissioned. While I was at Kure, trying with fellow students to work out the best methods possible of employing the submarines we would all command, our southern forces rolled steadily onward. On March 15th, General Douglas MacArthur told his unit commanders, "Help is on the way from the United States. Thousands of troops and hundreds of planes are being dispatched. The exact time of arrival of reinforcements is unknown, as they will have to fight their way through Japanese attempts against them. It is imperative that our troops hold until reinforcements arrive." The general and his men would see no ships or troops, except for a trickle of supplies and ammunition brought to Corregidor by submarine, the same vehicle MacArthur later used for his escape to Australia. No help got through to the beleaguered enemy. The Imperial Navy had unchallenged control of all waters where it operated in March and April, and the Imperial Army was rapidly securing control of all land masses. Tulagi and Guadalcanal were seized in May, a few weeks after Nagumo's planes made the first attack an aircraft carrier ever made on another. His far-ranging Sea Eagles buried HMS Hermes under a hail of steel in minutes, just as they had the British cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall. By the time spring came to Japan, that soft season when cherry blossoms, sakura, bloom first in the south, then creep northward and spread a pink and white blanket over my beloved homeland, the combined fleet was ready to rest on its oars for a while. Nearly all warships were home or headed home for refit, the carriers to obtain new planes and pilots to replace losses, the rest to get an overhaul in preparation for our next move. No one knew just what it would be, not even the members of our high command. They were arguing hotly about it, and would for weeks before a decision was reached. Then a man in the United States, whose name has been forgotten by most Americans and is unknown to nearly all Japanese, got an idea. He was Captain Francis S. Lowe, USN. Another man would take the lead in carrying it out. He is much better known to Americans and Japanese. His name is James Doolittle. Chapter 5. Victory via Midway? Once the first great flush of victory had passed, Japan's military leaders had to decide what to do next. So far, everything had gone just about as planned. Although we had, in the first 4 months of war, lost some planes and airmen that would not be easily replaced, we still had a mighty aircraft carrier force completely intact. Our battleships had not a scratch on them, chiefly because most of them rode serenely at anchor off Kure, while our other warships carried Japan's war effort 1/3 of the distance around the world. New submarines, destroyers, and aircraft carriers were coming off the ways too, but at nothing like the rate our leaders knew America could produce them. So Japan could not afford to sit still, waiting for the enemy to gain strength and assault us. Already his aircraft carriers had begun nibbling at our outposts. No nation ever won a war of expansion by pausing for long breaths between victories. Japan would have to consolidate her holdings and seek out and destroy any force that might be used against them. There were several schools of thought among the men responsible for Japan's strategy. One group wanted to push westward into India and perhaps link up with a German-Italian thrust across Africa and southeastern Europe. Another group wanted to keep pushing straight southward and seize Australia, the most logical base for a land offensive against the areas we had taken. This second group wanted to deny a great training ground to the Americans, who could build military, naval, supply, and air bases in Australia. The third group, the one that finally got its way, was centered about Adem, Yamamoto. Very much mindful of the 5 battleships sunk by our naval air forces at Pearl Harbor and the 2 sunk off Malaya, these men had been keeping a close eye on American carrier operations. These planners had an abundance of proof of what naval aircraft could accomplish, and felt that Japan's holdings could not be protected unless the American aircraft carriers were destroyed before they were joined by 2 or 3 times their number from busy American shipyards. It had not gone unnoticed in Tokyo that America had been gearing its industry to war for more than 2 years. Her effort to assist Great Britain had helped all sectors of American industry recover from a national depression. Much of America's unemployed found jobs in its expanding defense works, including shipbuilding. In spite of what many writers have said on the subject, the US was very much ready for war, at least industrially, on Date 7, 1941. Then our attack on Pearl Harbor unified what had been a divided national spirit. The citizenry was welded into a common effort to seek revenge. Japan could only win this war by working herself into such a position of strength that a negotiated peace would appear to be a better alternative to Americans than a bloody fight for many years in the Pacific. We needed another mighty victory like Pearl Harbor. What was left of US naval power had to be destroyed in one decisive battle. Adem. Yamamoto and those who agreed with him decided that a thrust to the east ought to be made. Target would be Midway Island, less than 1,500 miles from Pearl Harbor. If Midway fell into Japanese hands, the US would be delayed for years in mounting a Pacific offensive. Hawaii itself might fall. The Oceanic War would then become a stalemate, with Japanese naval power blocking any move westward. So, a move on Midway was bound to make the American Navy come out and fight. In that case, Yamamoto was sure it would be utterly defeated. The internal struggle that took place among our war planners when Midway was suggested as next objective has been adequately covered by other writers, so I will not till ploughed ground. Suffice it to say that the I operation, as it was called, finally won approval. Opposition still continued, though, while details were being discussed. Officers who were responsible for fuel supplies, replacement aircraft, provisions, supplies, and ammunition for the 5,000 troops needed to take and hold this island, kept producing statistics to show that this thrust to the east would strain Japan's resources to the limit and beyond it. They might have had their way, had not Capt. Francis Lowe suggested to Adams, Ernest King, that an attack on Japan proper might do wonders for American morale, while at the same time pushing us off balance. King agreed, and a plan was drawn up to use an aircraft carrier for this purpose. In order to drop as many bombs on Japan as possible, the US decided to experiment with some of its medium bombers, hoping that they could be flown from aircraft carriers. They called upon a former stunt pilot, Lieutenant Cole James Doolittle, to lead this effort. He did, to a success. A force of North American B-25 Mitchell bombers, named for a man who, interestingly enough, had predicted a war between Japan and the United States years before, suddenly appeared in our skies on April 18, 1942. This dramatic attack, coupled with ADE, Yamamoto's frequent earlier warnings about American aircraft carriers, turned the tide of argument as effectively as his threat to resign had done it a year before. It must be remembered that Yamamoto had been opposed to any war with America. He knew the power of America too well. He had confided to Prince Konoye that he could not guarantee any hope for success in a war after the first 6 months or year. So he advocated the surprise attack in hope of winning a major advantage with one stroke. He could lead a formidable force of surface ships plus 20 submarines in such an effort. Against the meagre strength pitted against him, these should prove overwhelming. And at Midway, he did have overwhelming odds on his side. Japanese aircraft carriers outnumbered American ones 8-3, battleships 11-0, cruisers 18-8, and destroyers 65-15. American submarine scouting strength was 15. The combined fleet sortie was to be the greatest array of sea power ever seen upon the ocean up to that time. Altogether, more than 200 ships would gather from all parts of the empire to move eastward, and submarines would also be striking to the north, south, and west. The Japanese Navy planned to strike not only at Midway, but also Australia, the Aleutians, and Diego Suarez, Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. Our submarines were to have an important part in the struggle for Midway. First of all, they were to help repeat the K operation of early March. 2. Emily flying boats would be used, as before, but they would not carry bombs this time. Their mission was to be strictly reconnaissance. They would again take off from Vosges in the Marshalls and land at French frigate shoals. There they would refuel from mine-laying submarines I-121 and I-123, which had their mine storage areas remodelled so they could each carry 50-ton loads of aviation gasoline and oil. They would have on board teams of mechanics to service the monster flying boats at the rendezvous. Letsuda Yasuo Fujimori had I-121, and Letsuda Toshitake Ueno had I-123. The third submarine in their division was I-122. Letsuda Sadatoshi Norita would patrol the small islets in the Hawaiian chain between French frigate shoals and Midway in Her. All 3 boats were under the command of Capt. Takeharu Miyazaki. Rear Admiral Chimaki Kono had Subron 3, composed of 5 submarines. 2 of these, Lieutenant-Kadata Yahachi Tanabe's I-168 and Lieutenant-Kadata Katsuji Watanabe's I-169, were to patrol off Midway, reporting any enemy activity there. Lieutenant-Dr. Rokuro Kawasaki's I-171, Lieutenant-Dr. Toshi Kusaka's I-174, and Lieutenant-Dr. Kameo Uno's I-175 would work to provide radio beacon and rescue service for the second K operation. If all went well, a pair of flying boats would be over Pearl Harbor once more. They would gather information on ships present. This would be relayed to Adiem Yamamoto, so he could use it in his plan to smash Midway with his air strength, then take it with troops. He fully expected that the American fleet would sortie from Pearl Harbor once this had happened, knowing it could not let Japan have this key base. Yamamoto then expected to send his refueled, rearmed, and rested airmen against the American ships, while at the same time he closed with his battleships and cruisers to clean up whatever was left. Once that happened, ships would be able to ply back and forth through our defence network as safely as though they were sailing the inland sea. Nothing would be left to fight them except a few submarines that could only operate out of Pearl Harbor, cutting radically their operation time in any combat area to a very low level. Naval planners who stood with Yamamoto even foresaw a move against Oahu itself before the end of 1942. Success there would truly make the Pacific Ocean a Japanese lake. Two other forces of submarines, meanwhile, were to strike in the south and the west. Rear Adam, Noboru Ishizaki, in his flagship I-10, commanded by Sea Dr. Yatsuchika Katahara, was to have I-16, I-18, I-20, and the new submarine I-50 with him in the Indian Ocean. They were to make a reconnaissance of the African coastline, and they were also to make an air reconnaissance of Diego Suarez, a former French base that British forces had taken over. They were also to launch a midget submarine attack at Diego Suarez at the end of May. Far to the east of Ishizaki's group were 5 more boats, I-21, I-22, I-24, I-27 and I-29. The last 2 were brand new boats. It was their task to make a similar air reconnaissance of Sydney, Australia, and also carry out a midget submarine attack. Our High Command believed that these 2 assaults would help unsettle the enemy and keep him relatively in the dark as to the combined fleet's true intentions. The attack on Midway would be brought off in such a manner as would jar American forces into immediate retaliatory action, which, of course, Yamamoto wanted to see happen. There was another diversionary operation also worked into the Midway plan. A strong northern force was to seize Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. Scouting there for it were Sea Dr. Meiji Tagami in I-25 and Sea Dr. Minoru Yokota in I-26. I-9, I-15, I-17 and I-19 were scheduled for the Aleutians too. The first 3 were to send off planes for reconnaissance flights, then move on to the south, leaving only I-19 in the north as a sentry on patrol. The trio would then form one of 3 sentry lines, deployed so as to provide warning of any American force approaching from the US mainland. These 3 sentry lines were actually the real core of the entire Midway operation. Added to the K operation, their task was to provide advance information of any US naval movement so that Yamamoto's ships could deal with it. All 3 lines were to be in place 5 days before X-Day, which was set for June 5th, Japan time. I-9, I-15 and I-17 were to station themselves on a north-south line far to the northeast of Midway, some 1,000 miles off the American west coast. They would watch for anything coming down from the north or from the northwest coast of the US. I-168 and I-169 were to scout off Midway Island and then move southeastward. They would take positions with I-171, I-174 and I-175 after these submarines had carried out their portions of the K operation. The Hawaiian chain of islands falls away in a generally southeastern direction from Midway, and ships approaching Midway from Oahu would have to come alongside one side or the other of the chain. The 5 submarines of Subron 3 would be somewhat south of French frigate shoals, lined up north to south. It would be their task to report, intercept and attack any forces coming up the southern side of the island chain. The 3rd patrol was to consist of 8 submarines under Subron 5 Commander Rear Adm. Tadashige Daigo. They were to station themselves about 900 miles due east of Midway, in position across the path any force had to take when proceeding from Oahu to Midway along the northern side of the island chain. They held the key role in the plans for the Midway battle. To the uneducated eye, viewing a chart of the mid-Pacific, the deployment of submarines in the Midway campaign probably seems excellent. Diversions as much as 5,000 miles away might help throw the enemy off the scent. Then, using the poor weather of the North Pacific to advantage, our aircraft carriers would race in from the north undetected, as they did at Pearl Harbor, and numb Midway's garrison into helplessness with one mighty blow. After that, our invasion force would come from the west, taking the island without trouble once its air defence was wiped out. At the same time, behind the carriers to the north of Midway, a massive battleship cruiser group would start moving down to back up the aircraft carriers that had never yet encountered difficulty in carrying out assigned missions. When the remnant of the American fleet hiding at Oahu came out to counterattack, it would be sent to the bottom by our planes, cruisers, and battleships. There was only one way the American Navy could thwart this grand plan, by keeping its naval air strength intact and hidden until some kind of opportunity came to strike hard and fast. Besides a great deal of skill, the American Navy would also need a great deal of luck to prevail against the overwhelming odds.